Hey everyone, thank you for joining me, your host, Max Pears. And this one is a fantastic episode. I am very excited because it's not only my smooth jazz that caresses your ears, but I've actually got a whole band together in where we're going to have a lot of good discussion about Final Fantasy VII. And my two amazing and phenomenal guests are none other than Jonathan and Blake. Thank you guys for joining me.
Hey, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
But before we go on, let's have a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's episode is brought to you by none other than GameDev.tv. For those of you who don't know, they are a phenomenal resource which helps you who may not have any experience to those looking to grow and improve their experience and knowledge on game dev related tools, whether that be programming, design, or art. All of these you can find on their website. And not only are they a great resource, but they've teamed up with myself to give you a phenomenal discount. If you go on and follow through the links that I've got down below, which give you a range of courses, you'll find that there is amazing discounts of over 80%. Normally a course costs around about £200, but luckily with the codes that we've got, and should I say the links down below, you'll get them for what would be about 40 to 50 bucks around that benchmark. So if you're looking to go for it, this is a great place to start your learning. I personally am going through the Unity Beginners 3D C# course myself, and I'm really enjoying it with great tutors like Rick and Sam, which have previously been on this podcast as well. So if you're looking to improve your skills, head no further than GameDev.tv. All of the links to the great courses will be down in the description below. Now back to the episode.
So before we get into the show, do you guys want to give a bit of introduction to who you are and how you got involved in game development and game design and level design? Blake, do you want to go first, mate?
Yeah, sure. Hi, my name is Blake Rubichet. I'm a senior game designer, quest designer specifically, at Guerrilla Games in Amsterdam. So I've been working in the field for about 10 years, though the majority of my career has been spent as a content specialist, someone who designs quests and content primarily on RPGs. So I worked, my first game was Epic Mickey. Down in Austin, Texas. Then I worked on Star Wars: The Old Republic at BioWare, and then I worked on The Elder Scrolls Online at ZeniMax Online Studios before I moved out here to Europe to work on Horizon Zero Dawn. Yeah, that was my first project with Guerrilla, and now I'm on Horizon Forbidden West. About half of my career has been spent doing level design specifically in the Horizon universe, but I still do quest and content design. So that's kind of where my heart is, and that's something I'd love to talk about when it comes to Final Fantasy.
So yeah, I've been bouncing around the industry for about 6 years now. I started out in Northeast, so in Newcastle, close to where Max kind of started out. And I worked for a bunch of indie studios. So I joined, I think, CourtSync back in like 2015. I worked with them for about like 3.5 to 4 years. In that time, I got to do platformers. I got to work on a bunch of VR titles, which was quite nice as an experience as that platform evolved alongside it. Level design had always obviously kind of been my passion, so I was always getting involved in those aspects of it. And then eventually, after spending some time doing some freelance work, I decided to look for a kind of full-time level design role within AAA, and that's when I joined Hangar 13, which I can obviously now say I joined them to start working on the remake for the original Mafia.
And it's great to have you guys here. Honestly, it's we've been talking this for a few months, so finally doing this, I'm very excited. And we said that we're going to talk about Final Fantasy the remake, but we're all old enough where we got to actually experience the original. And I just want to ask you what kind of impact did the original have on you? What was your experience playing the original Final Fantasy VII? Jonathan, do you want to go first, mate?
I get like for me, I think it was the early PS1 like generation when it just came out. Obviously, I was very young at the time, but it was kind of being wowed by like kind of the FMVs. But then when you actually start to play it and you start seeing the character development, the world around you, it started to kind of really pull me in, and that's when I think I got hooked fully on JRPGs in general. just seeing the way they did the combat, the world, the exploration, and I saw how all these systems started working together, and very slowly I was getting more and more fascinated, and I wanted to see how they could be done differently. So that started my love of JRPGs back way back when, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Final Fantasy VII was huge, right? Growing up in North America, I remember, it was the game that sold me on the PlayStation. And as a guy who works now for PlayStation Studios, I guess in a way you could say that was the beginning of my journey here. I remember getting this game, and I actually bought it before I even owned a PlayStation. I knew a guy down the street who had a PlayStation, and I bought this game, and I went to his house every day for 2 weeks to play this game on his PlayStation, if you can believe that. Yeah, and it had a grip on me, man. I can say that, like, thinking back on this, I'd played other JRPGs before. That was not a genre that I initially took to, but around kind of the era of like Final Fantasy 6/3 and then Chrono Trigger, like that era, Super Mario RPG, I really kind of fell in love with RPGs as a genre. Because I was a console kid, I didn't grow up with kind of the Western PC RPG stuff. So I started with JRPGs, and for me, it was crazy. Like I remember in North America, Final Fantasy VI is called Final Fantasy 3. So I played Final Fantasy 3, and then suddenly it was the PlayStation, and there was Final Fantasy 7, and I was like, "What happened to the other four?" My mind was blown. Or I guess it would be the other three. What happened to the other three games in the middle? And then you played this one, and it really felt like there was three missing games, between Final Fantasy 6 and this one, because it was like suddenly everything was in 3D. It was futuristic and dark. It felt so completely and utterly different in a way that was
Yeah,
magical.
man. No, I think it's. I think you're right. It's definitely one of those games because I was like you, like where I was a console kid as well, and I will say because I was pretty young when it came out, the combat definitely at first it took me a while to get used to because I was like, why am I waiting turns? Like I should just hit him. I've got this giant sword. But as you said, just when you get into it and the tone for it, the messages, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, just how still the message that it's trying to say about obviously saving the planet and also that of capitalism and greed and all that is still so prevalent in today, which is one scary and terrifying, but also amazing that it can still stand that test of time with relevance. And I think for me, when you think about, because we saw a lot of resurgence, especially in terms of the indie scene, about like 16 and 8-bit kind of graphics. I loved the style of these polygrammic characters. I thought there was so much charm to that. And I was kind of saddened that we didn't see more of that as it went through. But also, just like you said, the design of many different things was so different. We talk about being JRPGs, and it's definitely one of the first that I was introduced to. And when you think about this, these giant mechs with monsters, and yet for some reason, despite there being guns, your protagonist Cloud still uses a giant sword. When you think of that logically, you're like, what? But it just feels amazing when you're doing it, and yeah, the storytelling, especially I didn't know much about six. It's only recently I've gone into Final Fantasy six and how crazy and dark that story was. But for seven, like seven to me, other than Metal Gear Solid, was definitely one of those games which started to show that games can tell these kind of beautiful yet heartbreaking stories. So yeah, it definitely had. And Crisis Core, I don't know if you two had a chance to play Crisis Core.
Yeah, I played a little bit of it, but I not that
Yeah,
much.
I played it a lot.
Yeah, but that was the one for me that was definitely like one that made me go back and revisit the game when I was older. I loved Crisis Core as well. That's a one for me that was always heartbreaking.
I think with Crisis Core, it was like because it was many years like after the original, but it was such like great to see this prequel because there've been loads of other games that came out around it, whether they be mobile games and stuff in Japan, but there wasn't very much that made it to the West, which explored the additional lore of Final Fantasy VII, like who Cloud was, what he was before he became this merc for Avalanche and stuff like that. But actually getting to play as Zack, because obviously you find out about Zack in the original game in Final Fantasy VII storyline, but you don't find out that much about him. So to play the Crisis Core like part of the story, which is obviously the prequel, and see that entire process, literally, basically until you arrive at the beginning of Final Fantasy VII on the train, was very like a good way to switch it, and it give you so much more love for these characters. So seeing Aerith and stuff again, I think it was a really nice installment into the actual, like, I guess, the Final Fantasy VII saga.
We've talked about obviously now the impact it had on us, and for sure this game had an impact on games overall, the gaming culture. You know, it's constantly referenced in many people's like top 50 list of games of all times. It's constantly in the, you know, the top 15 for sure. And so then what was your reactions then, guys, when you first heard about the remake? What did you think of it? I'll pass it on to you first, Blake.
I need to gut check myself on this, but I think it is the case that the Final Fantasy VII Remake was announced at the same PlayStation conference that where Horizon was announced. I think this was like the PlayStation show of dreams, right? It was insane. It was like Horizon, Final Fantasy VII Remake. I think they announced Shenmue was coming back. Like, it was
Yeah,
this totally bananas show. Yeah, it was this completely insane show. So when they announced that, you know, I think that anyone who's been following games for a long time knows that idea of doing a 7 remake has kind of been sitting in Square Enix's back pocket for a while as kind of a trump card that they would play at some point in the future when they decided it was the right moment. And I definitely was excited, but I didn't know exactly what to expect. And I'm not sure I could have imagined what they eventually ended up doing with it, which, to be clear, I was pretty impressed with.
I was kind of similar to Blake. Like, I remember watching that E3 conference, and it was the chime. It was the first chime when the music kicked in. I was like, they're actually doing it. And it was just from that like first couple of seconds seeing it happen, and then seeing the trailer with Midgar was absolutely amazing. But this has been something that has to have been considered for a very long time, because if you remember way back when, the PS3 had a tech demo that recreated the intro sequence of Final Fantasy VII where Cloud jumps off the train. So it's kind of like they've dabbled with uprising this game, or at least recreating it in 3D for more like current gen consoles. And then who knows if that's how long they like stayed on it or whatever. But there's been rumors about the development of it have been going on for a long time. But seeing it actually come to life and be actually announced that it was coming to PS4 systems, it was like that was like kind of groundbreaking. As much as I was skeptical, because I was like, if they mess this up, am I going to hate this? Given my love for the original, it's kind of like, can they live up or at least give me something comparable to it? And like, in all honesty, they did that. I feel they succeeded in that aspect.
Yeah, I think looking back on this era as well, like when we think about when this game was announced, Square Enix wasn't in the best period in their history. You know, this was before Final Fantasy 15, which at least for me, like that game kind of reignited my passion for the brand a little bit. That was a game that I played it and I was like, oh wow, yeah, I totally can still dig a Final Fantasy game. You know, like 14 wasn't really for me, 13 was okay, but I was really impressed with what they had done with 15. So I was pretty excited to see what could come next.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think because I was the same, because I didn't know what to expect when I first heard about it. And obviously, there's always a big debate in the gaming community about remakes. This is, you know, it's by no means the first remake we've seen. Or Resident Evil 2 came out the year prior. Resident Evil 3 released the same year, I think, as this. Remakes, and we've seen Shadow of Colossus as well. And it's one of those ones where kind of I sit when it comes to remakes, I kind of like sit on the fence with it because I understand why people are sometimes against it because obviously you want to see new IPs developed, and obviously it does cost a lot of money to remake. But it's one of those ones where, unlike films, you know, you hear about constant classic films that you can still buy to this day. You can get the Blu-ray edition if you want to and watch. It's really hard to play some, you know, Blake, you referenced like Chrono Trigger. It's really hard to get some of these. Obviously, some have been re-released now, like Steam with Chrono Trigger. Other times you have to get emulators, and it is a shame that certain people, and like myself included, PlayStation 1 was the first console I ever got. And there's things that I will have missed out on prior to that. So I think it's nice to see it in the sense of how we can constantly give back to new generations of gamers.
Just going to touch on, I think you touched on it earlier. You said like this game had such a big impact across the industry, right? Like for what it's part of gaming history. So it's kind of like for them to finally remake it, because as much as because we've all played it, so going back to the old blocky graphics, we still get the charm from that because we experienced it when it was like it was the current thing. But trying to convince someone now in 2020 to go back and play the original can be a bit of a hard sell if you don't have that little bit of a vested interest. So obviously a full selling to someone on a full blown remake, and obviously me having played it, I can go, yeah, if you've never played a Final Fantasy game again or in the past, you can play this one and you'll be able to pick it up and kind of understand what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Because it's really, to return to Final Fantasy VII Remake, like it's a very modern game. Because it's a very liberal interpretation as far as what we think of as a remake or a re-release. It attempts to modernize things in a way that I do think is an accurate recreation of the memory of Final Fantasy VII, but it's not so much an accurate recreation of Final Fantasy VII.
I was gonna say, well, that's a nice transition point then, because you said they made some modernized updates for the design, and one of the ones that's obviously the most noticeable is the combat system. How did you two find that of the combat?
Yeah, I mean, speaking for myself, I thought it was fantastic. Yeah, I remember enjoying fondly the turn-based combat system of Final Fantasy VII, but it was very much a product of its era. And I think taken out of context, like seeing, if you tried to make a game with that exact same battle system now, it wouldn't have the same appeal that it did then. And I think so much of what this game tries to do as a remake is try to like capture the spirit of the original and make a new game that has the same spirit and vibe. And I think they did a really great job with that with the battle system. Where it still feels tactical, it still feels like not overly fast. It's by no means some kind of Soulsborne game, but it does feel informed by the modern era of action games. It feels like a game that you know is aware of Batman Arkham Asylum, is aware of Soulsborne games, that it nods to them and understands those. And that's what I like in a modern game, is an appreciation for the rest of what the industry is doing.
Yeah, it's kind of like kind of similar on my end. I was just amazed by how they managed to incorporate the old materia system into this new combat, like kind of iteration, this new combat system they had, because they took the old ATB system they had and still technically use it, but in a much more reactionary way. So you can very quickly on the fly switch between characters, queue them up, and set them off to do commands, and then go back to your main. And like Blake said, it's the fluidity of it does make it feel like it has the action of an Arkham game and stuff like that, despite it's not necessarily a fist fight you're going into. But the one thing I would say this is an accumulation of, they redid the combat for 15, which I did like, but I did think had its flaws. And then in 13, they did the stagger. They introduced the concept of the stagger system. I feel in this one, they've managed to merge them together and kind of get that perfect blend. Especially if you, for instance, if you use Tifa, like the way you can do juggling in this game is absolutely insane and not something I would have necessarily expected to work so fluidly.
Yeah, man. I tell you what I liked about this and also the original too is the fact that, like you said, the juggling and combination of materia, because they don't necessarily tell you about it, and it's through experimenting and even lining up your attacks. I didn't realize that till like a quarter into the game that I can still stick as Cloud, but if I press R2, go into the menu, commands menu, and press R1 or L1, I can line up other people's abilities. Yeah, like the strategy that comes with it, like once you start experimenting with it, it was so very much reminiscent of the original, because I didn't know that if you combine certain materia together, it could do some really amazing stuff. And the same with this. So I loved that kind of once you play around yourself, it really opens up even more.
To an extent, it's like it's rewarding your experimentation in that regard, and I think they give you a payoff for it as well, which is really nice to see, because sometimes it just doesn't accumulate or anything, but most of the time in this game, like I always found there was some kind of payoff for trying a different loadout or something like that.
It's a battle system that's very satisfying in and of itself. I've
Yeah,
talked to multiple people that say like, "Hey man, like this is Final Fantasy VII Remake, and that's great. Like, fine. Like, I wasn't a huge fan of the original or whatever, but like, I play this now and I just
yeah,
really enjoy playing it. The
hmm
combat's just fun. Like, I'll go out and do content just to engage with the combat system because it's cool. You know." To compare it to another game, I'm just playing through Ghost of Tsushima now, and Ghost of Tsushima also just has very satisfying moment
yeah,
to moment combat. That means that you're happy to engage with whatever piece of content you happen
yeah.
to find.
Speaking of like obviously looking for that content to engage, did you guys all do the arena, like all the arena fights? Because I feel that's like when you
Yeah.
start doing the arena or the VR missions, that's where the combat kind of really shines. because it's just an arena fight. There's not like any story you've opted into it, but like that's when you kind of start strategizing a bit more as well.
I liked the arena fight. I didn't love the fact that you had to like, don't you have to do the same match over and over again as single characters basically?
Different
Yeah,
characters.
I didn't love that bit of it, but I did really enjoy having to kind of strategize, the materia combos and the equipment and your loadout and stuff. I thought that was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked the VR missions when you were fighting the summons, for example. Like, I really enjoyed
Yeah.
those battles because you said you had to think a little bit more, and also the fact that you then earned the summons was
as well. Yeah.
Yeah, huge.
That stuff is hard, man.
Yeah.
Hard.
Yeah, I played it on easy, but we'll ignore that fact for later. But no, like, I tell you what I also find interesting is we talk about Square and how they adapt. Because I mean, as we play games, I'm sure you two feel it. Like I said, I wasn't the biggest turn-based combat fan, and I mean, I've never seen statistics that turn-based sells less versus more action-orientated combat. But Square constantly, to say that they're definitely one of the leaders of this genre of JRPGs, they're constantly experimenting. I'm always amazed, even if it goes right or wrong, as we talk about some examples, like how they just, and maybe to their detriment at some points, to not stick to a certain system, but that they're willing to experiment. I always find that amazing to see.
It definitely shows in the series as well, because like very early on, if you go back to the very early ones where it was like 1, 2, and 3, it was very kind of classic job system, but there was even experimentation kind of within that. And then like you mentioned before, like you loved 7, you loved the mood, you loved the characters and stuff like that. But then when you went to 8, it was something completely different again, right? Like the graphics were different, the way the characters were done, there was no concept of materia. It was just magic, and kind of it was all about how you junctioned your characters. So I think it's a way for keeping the brand fresh, but it also means if they find something that works and they hit gold, it can become the center point of the next game. And a little bit like how I do believe 7's combat system is multiple titles worth of work of trying, like you said, experimenting with different things. And they've just managed to find the correct amalgamation of different elements that really work for the Final Fantasy VII fighting system.
As I say, the one thing I loved with 15s was, and like you said, there was definitely issues with it, but like that flow of combat, it felt so good when you dodged, because it had the nice particle effects, but also time it well and the counters. So yeah, it's fascinating to see that and see how it's all kind of, they said, updated and mixed it. So my next point, by any means, guys, if you have any points you want to talk about, please let me know. But the next one I want to talk about then is, I guess, talking about the level design as well. Level designers and have our role with that. I guess, how did you find it, and kind of what were your thoughts on it? I don't know if you want to go first, Johnny, mate.
I guess like for me, I found it was like a really a kind of interesting approach, because this is like, we can't really say it's not a linear game, like, because it is, like, a lot of it is kind of corridors, but there are a lot of offshoots. But I like the hub, like the idea of the hub design. So when you first go back to the slums after you did the first reactor, it's kind of the first taste you get of how the quest and content stuff is going to be set up for the rest of the game. And I kind of found with that it worked on like a lot of levels. So the level design was nice because you got to explore Midgar. We got to see things we never got to see before in the original. We got to meet characters we never got to see before in the original as well. But the combat space, I don't know if you remember the one you go to first. You have to go into like I don't know, I think it's the junk area. That's just a loop.
Yeah.
It is just literally a loop you can go around, and obviously different quest givers send you into there to do different things. But the kind of like the loop worked, but then you had the offshoots. There are some little nooks and crannies you can kind of work your way into. But I think my favorite spot on it probably has to be Wall Market, because there's so many little hidden nooks and crannies you can get in behind, like in that, and like you just kind of like you stumble across them, and like it's not until really you've found them you start to pick up on it, or you've been hinted towards going here for ages. But there's a lot of stuff like that. Even the propaganda posters they use to guide you around is it the train tracks when you're going to like reactor 5? Like I thought that was a nice touch, like because you get to see the poster like earlier on in the game, and then it's like, no, this is a representative for that avalanche hints that you've been left for.
Yeah, I like that what they're doing with a lot, especially a lot of the hub spaces, is this kind of very classic hub and spoke stuff. It's not necessarily very classic to the Final Fantasy brand per se, but it's quite classic to, like, say, old school MMO design, something like World of Warcraft, where you've got the town and then you kind of got all these little wilderness spaces that surround the town. that you go out into, you return to over and over again for the content. And there's a certain benefit to pushing the player back and forth through, especially like lived in spaces. In like unlived in spaces, inorganic spaces are not necessarily so nice to be pushed back and forth through a lot. Like, see those funky tunnels with the giant robotic arms. It doesn't feel so great to go back and forth through those all the time. But I really like the towns, the spaces where I feel like I get a vibe of the people who live there and the culture of the people that live there, especially when I'm doing create some change in the space. That's really nice stuff.
Yeah, no, I agree with you both on it. And I think what's fascinating with me, and I want to get your opinions on this in a second, is because obviously at the very start of the original 5x7, it was very linear, to getting into the first reactor. And I think what's one of the biggest transitions with the spaces, especially due to technology, when you have those painted backgrounds and now they're into these full 3D environments, you get a lot to see with it. There's some brilliant views when you're heading up up inside Shinra's headquarters, and you get the view of a whole of Midgar, or when you're on the underside of the plate and you can see the slums below you. And that to me was great, in terms of how they team that up with environment art. So even if it was technically a corridor, in a sense, just the way that they give the illusion of space and how it still tells the story of the world, you get to be engrossed with it a lot more. You mentioned earlier then, Blake, about how when you revisit spaces which are living, and Jonathan, you mentioned like Wall Market and how all of that, really just tells more of the story. But I was interested in, because when you press, I think it was L2, you can get either the guiding compass or the kind of mini map up. And obviously, when it is the mini map, you start to see that it is very much corridor design. And I don't mean that in an insulting way, just that's how it's perceived, right? And especially Final Fantasy 13 got a lot of negative reviews due to the fact that people felt it was very linear. What do you think about having, say, mini maps, or that when your games are a bit more linear? Like I'm playing Last of Us 2 at the moment, and they don't really have that. And although that's slightly different level design, you still are. It is still a linear experience, but it obviously doesn't feel like that. Do you think maybe having mini maps can kind of, really kind of take you out of the immersion?
I'll go. So with minimaps, specifically in Final Fantasy VII, like I think they highlight, like you said, the corridor level design that you noticed. I feel if you didn't have the minimap, it wouldn't be necessarily as obvious because you wouldn't be looking at the flow of the space and the backwards and forwards you're going through it. I think a lot of minimap design kind of comes to, it's an expectation now. If you've got any kind of game that requires you to go and explore somewhere, or you've got to get to a specific location, some players do heavily rely on that stuff. As much as we all like to kind of do it diegetically and stuff like that, we can't remove them completely. We have to leave the option there for those players that would rather have the point of reference, or as if you think about it in real life, you'll get Google Maps up or something like that to find where you want to go. And it's akin of giving them something like that in a game. They are getting, like you said, getting used less and less in other games, but I think in RPGs like this, there is still like a need for them, because you find out where the location is, you have to go through a quest giver or something like that, and that's all it's really doing. It's just highlighting on the minimap for where you should be going based off information you've gathered as the player.
Yeah, I think that when we talk about modern RPG design, we're often trying to fight the player's tendency to want to play the compass, to want to play the UI. So we're constantly trying to see what we can do to resist that inclination, because we feel like that's unnatural in a way.
Yeah.
I've got a real passion for player guidance systems. If either of you watched my talk, I talk a lot about the systems that we use to diegetically and non-diegetically guide the player through open world spaces. As far as the design of the kind of the meta design of the levels in Final Fantasy VII Remake, I think it is funny. Like you can really, like in the last 1/3 of the game, you can really pop open the map and you can see how the whole game is this long tube. It's just like literally a long snake. But I actually, that doesn't bother me very much in this context, because Midgar is an artificially bounded environment. It is a city, and the majority of the time you're spending your time in these places that are like artificially connected together in very locked ways, and they take pains to explain that to you. Like, look, there's only one way or two ways to get from this area to that area unless you're going along the subway or you go up a plate or something like that. And so there is like a pretty good reason within the
Yeah.
confines of the universe as to why things are structured the way that they are. Whereas if I think back to the way I remember Final Fantasy VII, the original, and this is something we haven't talked about, but like I didn't play Final Fantasy VII recently at all. Like I only really have my memories to refer to. I think of that game as being like a lot of little pockets. You know, it's just like a lot of little spaces that I'm teleported between. There's no continuity of space. And I did like that, like what you were saying earlier, Max, that as you're playing through the whole experience, they try to give you quite
Yeah.
a grand vision of the way Midgar is put together, and you actually get sort of a sense of the way that the
Yes.
whole thing is bounded and constructed. And that's something I think that was lacking from the original game, maybe for good or for ill. Like I remember when I was a kid, just Midgar seemed like this unfathomably huge, crazy thing. Whereas in this game, I think it seems much more realistic in a way. You understand what its limitations are as
Yeah.
a structure.
No, both got great points there, guys. I really appreciated that. And I was gonna say, so now, especially is like you were talking about, your passion for a quest and kind of story for it. As this is something I think they added, because I don't remember this in the original, but the option for these side
Oh yeah.
quests and interacting with other NPCs. What was kind of your thoughts and experience when you did more of these quests then, guys?
Yeah, what they did was very classic. It's very classic. Like it's not classic in the sense that it's exactly what you would have played in Final Fantasy VII. It's actually kind of classic from an era slightly after that. So the kinds of quest design stuff they're doing, you definitely can't map it to a game like The Witcher. It's not that same kind of side quest style. The side quest style they have is still very Japanese in this sense that it's like, there's the town and there's like the 5 side quests that are in the town, and they all kind of relate to each other a little bit. Like there's a nice continuity to the narrative space of the hub where you feel like these characters genuinely relate to one another in a way. And so as you feel like you were progressing the ambitions and the needs of the people within that communal space, you feel like you're contributing to the betterment of that location, of that community. And that's the thing I like the most about the quests in the game. I think that mechanically they're not necessarily the most interesting. They generally really just leverage the base mechanics. So the quests are really just generally a wrapper to try to drive you to a part of the world you have been to or haven't been to yet. And there you'll experience the kind of core gameplay loop of the combat and the exploration. I generally prefer side quests that defy player expectation, or I prefer a rhythm of novelty that's a little higher in terms of the way that I think about quest design. But I think that to compare it to another game that I played last year, to compare it to The Outer Worlds, it's a game that its quest design is very much a comfort food. Like you're playing it and it's what it is, what the structure is, what's expected of you, about how long it is, and there's something very satisfying about that in a way, especially because they make it clear that there's not a ton of it. There's just so many of these things in each area, and if you do all of them, you get a special goodie. And they make that very clear that like if you do all these bits, you get a special goodie, right? And like in the first zone, right, you get that nice scene between Cloud and Tifa that's like probably the first moment where you feel like their relationship's starting to warm again. And it's this like incredibly nice scene where you get to like choose the dress that she's gonna wear and all this stuff. I loved that as like a little end cap. I really felt rewarded for doing all of those side quests that individually I didn't necessarily feel like were mechanically the strongest, but I felt the payoff was great. And you didn't have to give me like some amazing piece of equipment or like the amazing sword or whatever. You just gave me something that was equally delicious to me as a player, like some really great narrative payoff.
No, it's from a mechanical standpoint, I definitely agree. The quests themselves were definitely like simple, but for me, the payoff came from a lot of the narrative and the exploration you got to do, because we never got to like do this in the original, these side quests. We went to Midgar, we went to slums, we went to kind of like Seventh Heaven and Tifa's bar. So we saw these as like a quick highlight reel previously. But like the payoff from those quests, there was like a little bit of combat, which we enjoy the combat system, so that's great. So it's highlighting that. But like you got more investment from Tifa, you got to explore the world, you got to meet the people, so you actually got to feel as part of that community of the slums a bit more as well, which gives a lot more impact for what happens later on and things like that. So a lot of it is that like narrative stuff coming in and like helping you ground you in this world. And I think that also happens in every like area. So when you go to the next area you first see Ayla's house, you start to understand a lot more about what she does, like for her like community, I guess. Whereas we don't get to see much of that before. Obviously, we know she tends to the flower bed and stuff, but we don't get to see her like outreach outside of that. And it just grounds you all in that, and it makes it attainable as well. Like Blake said, there's not a lot of it, but when you enter each zone, you can see it's an attainable goal to do all these quests before you move on, and then you get the nice payoff at the end with, like in the first instance, the scene with Tifa, which is quite a nice payoff to have.
Yeah, no, I agree with both of you. I think you've said kind of my thoughts on it. Like I said, it's more there to help build a bit more of the world. You get a payoff for it. And I do think it's also interesting, again, just going slight differences between, designing for us, who are Western developers versus those who design out in Japan. Like you said, for example, we talked about Witcher 3 and how that really kind of set a benchmark in terms of how to do side quests and how far you can push them. Yeah, Japanese developers, and again, there is no right or wrong answer when I say this. I'm just saying that it's amazing that when it comes to that, they're focusing, like I say, it's something, a little bit of like comfort food for the player. It doesn't elevate anything too much in terms of difference with mechanics, but it is just, again, nice dressing for the player. So I did enjoy that aspect too. And I guess for one of my, sorry, does anyone want to say anything before I move on topic?
Well, I will say, I will add one thing that's kind of, it's a funny realization I had somewhat recently, because this is something we think about within the context of the world of Horizon a little bit too, is like The Witcher popularized this kind of concept of the character having a job and the job being the function that they deliver to the world, and you use that as context for narrative, right? Like Geralt is a Witcher, and that's his job, and that's what he does, and so he has this like very appropriate narrative entree into many situations that are kind of oddball. And I like that. I can tell that they did something very similar here with 7 Remake, where Cloud doesn't say much in the original game, but in this game he's constantly telling people like, look, I'm a merc, I'm in it for the money. Like, he talks to someone and they're like, I really need you to do this thing, and he's like, well, I'm a mercenary, you can hire me for the job, like that's my MO. And you do get a very clear sense of, or you get a much clearer sense now of Cloud's internal thinking and his own perspective as an individual character through this kind of role that he inhabits and delivers for the people of this community. Initially, he really is this kind of like dry, I'm in it for the money kind of merc. And over the course of the game, he becomes much warmer to these people because he does these services for the community. And so by the end, he's kind of like, hero for hire. And that very, like, if you guys know that comic book at all, like Luke Cage and like, the community superheroes kind of guy, that he's that dude for them, he's Midgar's like local superhero.
And I mean, that's stuff that you're all touching on. It's like it all accumulates towards the end of the game when you're doing the climb towards the Shinra building, and they have that scene where he's like, oh, as long as there's money involved, but they just laugh at him at that point. Because it's built to that point of where he has become, like Blake said, the hero for hire, where it's not just about the money anymore. He has developed some kind of, I guess, compassion for these people of the slums.
At Level Design Lobby, we believe everybody has a story to tell. Hobbyist or student, freelancer or veteran, we made it our mission to unite those who share our passion for creating and developing great games. Thanks to our generous Patreon backers, we've been able to do just that. So if you've already pledged your support, thank you. If not, you too can ensure the future of Level Design Lobby, helping us to create even more exciting content, collaborations, interviews, and much more. With awesome perks and rewards, whether you're a seasoned professional or just getting started, you're sure to find something for you. Want to share tips, tricks, and advice with passionate, like-minded developers? Our awesome community Discord has you covered. Fancy practicing your level design, creating strong portfolio content, and having fun? Then try our level design weekends. Or perhaps you want to individually discuss your work, hone your skills, or level up your career? Then consider our one-on-one mentorships. If you share our vision, then go to patreon.com/Level Design Lobby for more information and to pledge your support. Thank you.
I want to touch on now a bit more of the kind of environmental storytelling on this, because they really pushed that out from the original. Obviously, tech is part of that, but especially in terms of, I don't think in the original it showed enough of like, because you technically are a terrorist, you're a freedom fighter, right? Depending on the point of view you want to look at it. And just showing the damage of what you have done, especially from the first reactor, and seeing, all these other places like destroyed and people who've lost the other ones, others are injured, their service, like first aid services, are all there trying to solve it. And kind of the guilt that, Jessie feels to the point where it leads to a side quest for her. And I really did appreciate that because it makes you stop and think for a little bit. Like, yes, you are doing it for good intent, but just because you have good intent, I mean, you see it in Barrett a lot, doesn't mean that it's going to let people like you, because it does come with a cost. I really did appreciate that in terms of showing.
So just real quick, I think that's a really interesting topic to touch on, environmental storytelling. But did you guys play Final Fantasy VII? Did you like refresh yourself before you went into this experience, or did you go in with there being quite a bit of time before you played this between the original?
So I played about a couple of hours. So I'd done the bit on the original. I was playing it on my PS Vita, leading up to, I think it was up to the Golden Saucer, so a little bit after where this remake ends. So that's where I got up to prior to it.
I'd started playing it I think at Christmas last year. I started replaying it, and I think I started on Switch and got just out of Midgar. I think I just getting to Costa del Sol, so I did the Midgar segment. So I'd refreshed myself on that, but obviously beyond that, anything else didn't really matter or impact. So I was quite fresh on the events that happened in Midgar, and how long that would take in theory.
Gotcha. Yeah, I got to that Jessie mission, and I was like, man, there's a lot of stuff in this game I don't remember. Was this? There's a whole soldier guy with a motorcycle, and he's just a cool dude, man. I didn't remember any of this stuff. Turns out it was all fresh.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that was the really nice thing, because obviously having that memory in my mind of just finishing the Midgar section and then seeing how they were, padding's not a nice word, but how they were fleshing this out into a 40 to 50 hour game, when that section itself is maybe 5 to 6 hours, was really impressive. But so yeah, the stuff like the Jessie stuff was just mind blowing.
Yeah, I agree. And just how, because was it Briggs, Wedge, and Jessie? They're not really that present in the original. Like you said, to see them getting fleshed out, and I loved seeing the reference to Soldier, because I was a huge, as I mentioned earlier, Crisis Core fan. So to see them kind of show the design of the uniforms that they had and set in that of Crisis Core, and show it in these other members. And I will say that Soldier, and I can't remember his name, is one of the funniest characters to me, because I refer to him with friends as being very fight sexual, is the term I use. Because he would have been fired or reprimanded because he stopped Shinra's soldiers from attacking Cloud because he realized Cloud had bested him. Yeah. And then, when he's having these interactions with Cloud, he's like, yeah, boy, this is how we fight. And he's just like, I don't know if this is too enjoyable for you, sir. But yeah, I loved all of that. Yeah, there was definitely some weirdness.
I mean, just to touch on that for a second, this is just an incredibly thirsty game in general. So many characters in this game are just they're just over the top in a way where, they're chasing. So many people seem to just be chasing Cloud around, essentially. They just love what he's about, period. And I think that at one point in time, we would have talked about how this was some kind of manifestation of power fantasy. But in a way, I don't know if it's that anymore. It's almost comedy now. It's almost designed to make the player a little uncomfortable with how intense it is.
See, I didn't get that, mate. I did think it was just a massive play on power fantasy still. And it just my opinion. Just because of we said this off air, but Cloud is, if he was a real human being that we, for example, invited on this podcast, or you hung out, grabbed a beer with him, let alone putting him in a date situation, would probably not be very attractive to many people because he has the personality of a wall with some thoughts. He does obviously grow. We talked about that earlier, but his responses are very much like how Jessie's into him, and yet he's constantly telling her or Wedge to just not interested, one word answers. And so, yeah, I think it does border with comedy, but I still felt it was that power element, and I felt it a little bit definitely uncomfortable for it.
Do you guys follow Jen Bartle on Twitter? Have you ever seen her? She's a fairly well known comic
No,
artist, and
no,
she
no, I
just
haven't.
loved Final Fantasy VII Remake. So every other day she's posting these sketches she's done of like Tifa and Cloud, or Cloud and Aerith, like just feeding the massive thirst of the internet for desires for shipping from Final Fantasy. It's like we've returned to this period in time. Like I remember when people used to draw fan art of Cloud and Aerith and Tifa and stuff, but now it's all of us
Yeah.
successful adult creative types who are just reliving this ship fantasy of our young adulthood.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just definitely a weird aspect to see because, like I said, Jessie didn't play a huge role, but she never seemed. And correct me if I am wrong, but I don't remember her being that interested in Cloud. And the relationship more with Aerith and Cloud was a bit more kind of innocent in how those two kind of communicated. And then Tifa, it wasn't until in the back half of the game where you actually saw the relationship, because obviously we're going to do spoiler warning from here, team. If you
Yeah.
listen to it so far, we've done so well without talking about spoilers, but F it, I'm going for it now.
Yeah.
But like when you find out that Cloud, sorry,
Clown.
has
Clown Strike, epic protagonist.
guys, we've got the remake nailed.
They've
Like,
remade it hard. Clown Strike.
oh, Clown, you're so amazing.
That's what the translation was supposed to be. You understand?
No, was it?
Yeah, Clown
Well,
Strike.
dude, no way. Fucking hell. The more you know. But just you see their relationship and how uncomfortable she was when she's hearing these stories about Cloud, but they're not correct, and she's trying to figure out him again, and that shows their relationship. While here, Teep is very much again like, "Hey, big boy."
It's very fascinating because you're dealing with characters who have a memory of each other. You're reintroduced to the situation of this game initially through action and through combat and through battle, right? Where you and Barrett and the rest of the crew are going out to do this thing. But then when you're reintroduced to Tifa, we've wandered off the point of environmental storytelling here. But when you come back to Seventh Heaven and you get to meet Tifa for the first time in 7 Remake, it's like this a moment where she's seeing Cloud again after years and years and years, and there's this moment of kind of nostalgic connection that you are also feeling as the player playing this game. If you also have that nostalgic connection to Final Fantasy VII, that I think is kind of fascinating, and that there is an emotional synchronicity there between you and the game and Cloud and Tifa. But I mean, going back to the overall topic of environmental storytelling, I feel like they do so much of a better job trying to show you the way that Midgar works.
Yeah.
I really have so much of a finer understanding of what the thing is. I think in the original game, I watched Did you guys watch the epic 3-hour long dissertation on Final Fantasy VII from Tim Rogers?
No, I've not seen that.
No, but I
Send it.
want to see that.
Oh man,
Yeah.
that guy is pretty amazing. He started a YouTube channel fairly recently to do these extremely long form discussions of games that he's played. And he was making the point about how in the original game, like the people who live under the plate can't even see the sky.
Yes.
It's like they live in this perpetual world of night or something. And they changed that quite pointedly in this game, where when you're up there in the kind of rafters and you're seeing out in the skybox, you see the actual outside world squeezed between the bottom plate and the top plate, as this kind of line of the horizon.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, right? And they go to lengths to show you the big lamps that they use to simulate sunlight, and the way that the plates connect to stuff. And now I understand sort of the way the highways and the train system kind of works, whereas that didn't make any sense to me at all when I was younger.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, and also just hearing Shinra employees. Barrett has that dispute with them, and then you see that on the streets when stuff has been when the reactors have been attacked, because people are worrying about will they go back to work? Are their loved ones safe? Are their co-workers okay? And it just shows you also how big of a corporation, as you said, like Shinra is, and how really, because I think that was one of the biggest things. Is obviously you saw the outer plates and the original, but to see that Shinra has such a presence in the community because it provides so many jobs, and also people use the Mako to light up the environments and produce fuel, was so, yeah, just really grounded it.
It was cyberpunk, bro.
It's got so many different elements involved with this, whether it be steampunk, cyberpunk, all these different kind of elements involved with it. It was crazy.
I mean, I think it's one of the first games I can remember talking about capitalism or themes of environmentalism. People talk these days about, people desire for their games to be less political in a way. But when we think about Final Fantasy VII, that's a tremendously political game from, 1992 or something? Tremendously political. I think I'm off there. I think maybe it was 97.
Yeah, no, mate, it's something that I said it just feels so relevant to today, and especially and we're seeing it in a lot of, well, especially our home countries. You're really seeing divide between the rich and the poor recently, and we're not going to make this podcast too political, but just saying how like you said, it just communicates that private militaries are very much up for hire these days as battles for different areas are waged through private military corporations having far more controls of places, big corporations not even paying taxes in certain areas. It really shows that.
I guess one thing I would add is this. When I started playing Final Fantasy VII the first time when I was younger, it was part of this whole zeitgeist of like getting into anime and Japanese culture and all this stuff. Like it bled over into all these other things I was consuming and kind of encouraged me to consume more. And you guys grew up in this era as well. Like there was so much of this stuff that we were getting into that came from Japan, and so much of it had like funky translations and very like kind of strange storytelling that was a product of the fact that a lot of it was kind of mistranslated. And Final Fantasy VII is notorious for this. Like it's in its original form, like nigh incomprehensible, like extreme, like it's almost philosophical, right? I can remember playing it and it was so it was like Zen koans or something. Like it was extremely hard to understand what they were trying to say, but that made it seem somehow more important and more fascinating. If I were to compare it to something like Evangelion or something, that's a show that is like rich with meaning and philosophy, but it presents itself sort of obliquely, like in a difficult to process way. And I always felt the same way about Final Fantasy VII. But I think that Remake goes out of its way to try to be much, much clearer about where it's coming from and what it's trying to say, which I appreciate. I think that's kind of nice.
I mean, like that's definitely clear because it's there in the game's messaging. It's like we were talking about the world and kind of the population of it as well. Like you see the ramifications of everything you do this time around. Whereas before it was like we said, you saw like a panel, then you moved on, you're on the train. You actually have to walk through the destruction of whatever you've just caused, and then as you go through the game, like hearing NPCs like chatter as you're walking around, and it's always about an event you've done or something that they heard happened or a rumor which is leading to the next thing you're going to do. And I feel that just helps ground you in the story but also add gravity to everything you do as this kind of like anti-terrorist group.
Yeah, I completely agree, mate. I think it's nice to, like you said, feel that because it adds a different side to the story that we're viewing, right? We believe we are the good guys. Obviously, we're our merc as well, but we want to believe that we're doing things for the right reason. But yet to see people who are not a fan of your actions, and you get to see why, because it is a scary thing to see, and obviously your loved ones can be taken away. And I think also, I don't know about how you guys felt, but it made me question a bit of Barrett as a character at certain points.
There are some deeper questions to ask, right? And they've made the world a little more complex in a way than it was at one point in time. Barrett has this great speech that he gives, or at least he has a one-liner in the Shinra Tower where he talks about, how a man has to understand that he's complicit with the ills of an organization he's part of. But they've also gone out of their way to restructure Avalanche in such a way that Barrett is not the leader of this organization, that there's this other layer above him that they only kind of barely get into talking about. but it's clear that that organization is more militaristic and
Yeah.
more violent than Barrett is. And so, in a way, what he's saying is also true about himself. He's part of a fairly violent institution that he's complicit in the
Mhm.
acts of. And he has to understand that the same way that anyone who works for Shinra has to understand that they're complicit in the acts of the larger company.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned obviously they touch on showing that there is this wider Avalanche group, which is something we never really got a sense of in the original. But obviously this time around, it's something you see like at the forefront when they come in. They kind of bail you out during the kind of the Jesse mission at the end after you've fought with Roach. Do you think that's something that will get explored further as they go down the line? Because obviously once you get to the end of this game, we've left Midgar. And like once you leave Midgar in the original, the story becomes less about Avalanche, and like they all have their own mission now, right? It's kind of to save the planet, but it's more about their journey than it is about Avalanche's
Yeah,
main mission.
so basically Avalanche is funded by Wu Tai, and you hear that mentioned a few times.
Hmm.
And like I said, it's an interesting point because if you play Crisis Core, you know a little bit more about the Wu Tai and Shinra War, and that's why
Yeah.
Wu Tai end up funding Avalanche. But also, they like you mentioned the
Hmm.
mobile game, which is called Before Crisis, and that has a reference to how again Avalanche comes to be, but it's a different branch, and you do
Hmm.
interact briefly with Barrett. I think they'll talk about it because also Yuffie comes from a Wu Tai nation, so I do think that will
Yeah.
be mentioned a little bit. But as you said, the because they didn't focus, so they focused a bit more on, like say, expanding Avalanche. But I will say in this retelling, they didn't focus so much on necessarily the damage on the planet. I felt like before we talked about off air, obviously they introduced Sephiroth very early in this compared to the original, and part of that was I think they wanted you to feel that
Yeah.
okay, the planet is the number one priority. There really is an issue with using the planet resources to fuel your cities. But this one, I don't feel they did a lot of that. And in the original, it comes back to that slightly later in the game. So
Hmm.
I think they will, but as for how much, I don't think it's going to be a great deal. But I could be wrong. All speculation.
Well, they still need to introduce Yuffie, right? Like, I highly doubt we're
Mm,
gonna meet Yuffie in the same way we met her in the original, because you encountered her in a random
yeah.
encounter by running around in like a forest on the world map, right? I don't think that's gonna happen. I don't think it's gonna happen this time around. The same with some of the.
No, I think that they've already said that they're changing things such that Yuffie and Vincent are mandatory
Yeah.
characters now. They're part of the
Yeah.
guaranteed
Yeah.
narrative.
And I mean, like with that regard, it's like another thing that's obviously probably going to be absent from a lot of this is like the side quest you did in the original to get like certain summons and stuff that you could miss. Like, I don't think that's going to happen this time around either.
Yeah, you guys want to place bets on whether we're going to get a Knights of the Round? Is that going to happen?
Yeah.
I think they will, but I'm not
Yeah,
sure. I
it's the
think because
most most
one of the best
notorious
ones.
summon,
I
Yeah,
probably.
I feel it'll be if they do it like the get out of jail free card they have here, right, is that VR arena, which is how you get a number of the summons already in the game.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like I feel if they want to get them all in,
Hmm.
that's probably how they're going to shoehorn them. Although I'd be all up for a Knights of the Round side quest to just like
Hmm.
put that in the game, mainline it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Just I don't want to go through all of the pain of the original. So hopefully it's a little bit.
So, I mean, are we in a place now where you guys want to talk about sort of setting our sights to the future and trying to anticipate where they're going to go next? Because
Yeah,
I think that there are some interesting questions here, level design wise. Like,
Mm.
yeah.
would you expect that the next title in this series is going to be open world? Or do you think they're going to continue using the same kind of linear canyon structure that they've used for the level design of this title?
So I feel we're still going to get that linear like canyon structure where we get pocket like new pockets, like new sandboxes to explore and do quests in or whatever. But I also wonder is will they take the approach they did with Final Fantasy 15? So that wasn't a massive open world, but it had like a quite large area you could explore. You could walk between multiple locations. I'm wondering if they do that, but only for certain segments of this game going forward. Because you could easily do it for like the run to the village you go to after you leave Midgar, where kind of they recount the story. I don't think they'll let you do it across the lake, but like for when you're going to Nibelheim to go to Sethos Manor, I feel you could almost do that journey. So I don't think it's going to be fully open world, but I think we might get these mini sandboxes akin to what we saw in Final Fantasy 15.
See, I got a feeling that one of these episodes is going to do it because the amount of vehicles you had, and Sid's very much about who Sid is based on the airship, right? And
the rocket to outer space.
Don't forget that, kids. But I think because of these vehicles, I think at one point that one of these episodes, I think, is going to be. I'm not talking about like a Ubisoft traditional sense of the open world, but I think to really take use of these vehicles, I think it's such a tough one. I'm going to put a bet down that one of them has like a bigger kind of hub world, shall we say, something similar to that of like Uncharted Lost Legacy kind of vibe. I think one episode will do that, but other than that, I reckon other vehicles will be like the motorcycle and the car chase, which is more of a mini game for it.
I think what Jonathan said, I think is I got to imagine you know, you look at Square Enix's own catalog, and Final Fantasy 15 is their open world game, you know. So I imagine if they go in that direction, it's going to look like that game, which is fine by me. I think Final Fantasy 15 is a really cool open world, but I'm wondering, you know, again, it's been a long time since I played the original. Is there some tidy way they can split the world in two? I'm not sure that they can.
Yeah, so like I've had this discussion with like a few people since finishing it. Like knowing how Final Fantasy VII is structured, like obviously you leave Midgar, you go to the little village, you go across the river, and then at that point you're heading to Junin, and then you go across Junin to Costa del Sol. So it's like, is the next chapter just that? Because that's not a lot of gameplay unless they flesh it out. There's not a lot of major locations for you to visit in that little island span outside of Midgar. So it's like that would have to be a dividing point, right? So if they did the Final Fantasy 15 approach there, you're only really doing it to go to the village, go across the lake, and then get to Junin, which I imagine Junin would become like one of the hub worlds we had in Midgar, where there's a bunch of different quests to do before you actually sail across the sea. But it's like, do they end it there, or do they actually keep going? Because like now we're talking about like almost like story pacing and what they introduce and when they do stuff when. And I think we'll get onto it later, but it's like the ending, the way this game ends, they almost have an open book, right? They can almost do what they want now.
Yeah, I think that imagining the shape of what the next chapter is going to be, whether linear or open world or semi, I think it's a very fascinating question, because I think Midgar like really lends itself very well to the kind of level structure that they built. But it's difficult for me to imagine anything for the next chapter that isn't, you know, an open world full map.
Yeah. No, I agree. I reckon I would like to say Final Fantasy 15 is probably the style they go for that style of open world, with some like Junin, for instance, being the linear section you do in that.
Yeah, it's one I'm scratching my head on, and I'm glad in some sense, not only for the reason I get to play this and not be part of the development team, but also glad I'm not have to worry and try and think about this, because I think it is a big design challenge. And I mean, I remember, what was it? Ni no Kuni was like the last game I saw, which kind of had this open, like
the old school JRPG map.
Yeah. And I don't know if there's a reason for that in terms of like, because it is a very, like I said, an old school element. But I always remember at the original, like as soon as you finished Midgar, they said the map really opened up, right? They filled it a lot with random encounters and optional discoveries, like we mentioned with Vincent and Yuffie. But it was one of those ones where they said you saw the scale. Like Midgar already felt very big when you were in there. But then when you see, and I think also part of the fun of the journey of Final Fantasy VII is seeing a lot of that world, seeing how Shinra has affected and impacted different cities, villages, and people's opinions on it. So I think, I don't know, I definitely see one episode at least having kind of a more open world vibe to it. But I think that's the other question is do you wonder when, I'm not asking us to put bets when it comes out, but I do wonder how much time it's going to take for episode 2 to essentially come out, and this is probably going to be a 4-part game,
Yeah.
more than likely.
Well, we're all
And-
assuming, like, if we go by discs, right? Like, it'll be the original's 4 discs. This will be 4 episodes. But I think the hard part is, obviously we're talking about how they do the open world is, but it's like, if we think about the story as we know it, and obviously
Yeah.
assuming that the retelling they stick to, obviously certain things can change. What is the cutoff point of episode 2? Like, what is the cutoff point of episode 3? Because to be fair, disc 4 is basically the Sephiroth fight. It's you going down into the live stream, right? That's not really. I don't want to pay $60 for that. So,
No. Yeah, I think it's more likely we're going to see 3 games, personally. That's my suspicion. Four is pretty awkward. And I think it would start to be, I mean, what if we're talking about 4 games, you're talking, about 12 years from now.
If we're lucky.
Like,
Yeah.
if we're being generous with when we would see that final game. And I think that's too long to pull out the concept of something that's a contiguous entity. Like I mean, Final Fantasy VII is one thing, and I know that given what we saw at the end of this game, that they're going to be making some greater diversions in the future in a way that can change the structure of what's coming. I don't think that. I think that they're going to use what's there as a structure to play from, but I don't think that we're going to get everything beat by beat the way that it was, especially as we approach the end. I think that that third game is the one where it's going to go off the rails. If it goes, if that happens, that's where it's really going to get different.
So, like, with that in mind, then I guess, do you think that let's see whatever episode 2 is, we just see like small repercussions for kind of what they've done? So, like, when you beat like Destiny or whatever, and this is where they breach the concept of multiple timelines, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, do you think in episode 2 we see some of the repercussions of what that meant, what they've actually done, and then by the time it just gets weirder and weirder as we continue, and then episode 3, is that where possibly Zack's still alive and they actually run into each other and stuff like that? Do you think they go that weird, or do you think that's too far and it's undoing some of the nostalgia like Max has for Crisis Core and stuff like that?
I think we're going to deal with that question almost immediately in the second game.
Yeah.
Because, that's like coming off of the end of the first game. Again, spoilers. Like, that's like what has actually changed. That's the big one thing. Right? In terms of material changes, like a lot of stuff has happened in this weird ghost dimension or whatever, but like none of that actually really did anything. Like, what has actually changed between the world of the old and the world of the new? The only thing that we know that has really changed is we know that Zack is alive. And that's going to have consequences. That's the only thing that we know for sure is going to have consequences that we're going to need to see the effects of pretty quickly.
Well, it's because it's a big one, right? Because he's with Cloud. It's like his death is almost what makes Cloud become who he is. So
dude, I don't know what it means at all. I don't know what it means at all. Like, does that mean that like they know that this has happened? Is what's happened is that there's a weird parallel universe now or something?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, because if that didn't happen, is it possible that Cloud wouldn't know about it if the past had changed, quote unquote?
I think, like, because for me, that's what excites me about the future of this now. Is it's like, I know the game, I love it, I love the original story to bits, but like what they did with Midgar, the original remake, they've shown me that I just like that world, right? So if you can give me more content in that world, I'm all for it, and I'm happy to see it. But now with this whole timeline thing, which is obviously, once again, it's a very anime thing, but I think they did stuff similar in like Kingdom Hearts and stuff like that.
I mean, they did.
It's like
it was a tough one, right? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but like
no, it's fine.
The timeline thing is I think it's tough in every medium that you do it, especially when it comes to that, and especially if your game's not, or TV show or anything, is not focused primarily on the sense of time travel. It's it's a hard one to execute, but like you said, mate, it's exciting. Also going to be very heartbreaking for me. I'll get the tissues out because I'm going to cry if I see that again. But it's a very...
One thing I'll say is like this is the great. I mean, whether you love it or whether you hate it, because I know some people don't like the changes, some people really do. I'm in the latter camp. The great triumph here is that this has created now an even greater sense of expectation and a question of what is going to happen, because now none of us know. Like,
Yeah.
we have things that we think we know are gonna happen. And
Mhm.
we've known this from the beginning, right? Like, spoilers, everyone's waiting for Aerith to die.
Yeah.
But is that gonna happen now? And it's a huge question of like, would, because now they're planting the seeds of, we could make this not happen. But
So
will they, right?
so
Like,
yeah, so with that, like, obviously the Aerith death is a big one. Do you think
yeah.
that's something they would leave it up to player action and like player choice? So like when I say that, like
No, that's not what this.
no, but in Midgar, it's
Yeah.
like there are certain things you can do, and it affects certain scenes you get in the game. So there's the one, I think it's the beginning of chapter 9. Based on who you've interacted with, will determine who you have the scene within the flower garden. So there's small stuff like that, which, to be honest, you don't really think is going necessarily tracked or untracked until you get that scene, and then you find out people get different, saw something different based on what they've done.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any pivotal change now going forward of stuff we know that we expect to come, they would allow to be influenced by actions the player makes throughout like that episode?
I think that they'll do stuff like that where they adjust the flavor, but I don't think that they're going to start ending up in Mass Effect territory where they're changing whole plot points depending on your prior action. I do know that they know that everyone's waiting for that thing to happen, and so they're going to mess with our sense of expectations around it. So, like, I fully expect that, for example, I could definitely see it being the case that we get to that moment in time and it doesn't happen there. But then maybe it happens in some different way later.
Yeah.
That's the kind of bait and switch I would expect to see, where you approach this moment of destiny where this thing is supposed to happen, and they manage to, snatch a new destiny from the jaws of fate. Yeah. But then it ends up playing out in some different, equally tragic way somewhere else. That's the way I would expect them to go. If I had to like place bets, you know what I mean?
I was gonna say I agree. Like Aerith, losing Aerith, it was like, we talked about the impact of Final Fantasy VII as a whole, but losing Aerith was the biggest moment in terms of like caring for a character in games, in my opinion. Like there has never been or hasn't been talked about so much. There are other great examples. Ico is a phenomenal one. Last Guardian, Ori and the Blind Forest, but there's never been one that has like really been spoken about or had such an impact like Aerith. So I agree, like they're going to change it around or like versus that. And I mean, the interesting thing is we're talking about Zach now and as a fan of Crisis Core, but in the original game, you could have missed all of Zach's stuff. You might not have had it. The interaction with his parents was like an off chance encounter too. So maybe there'll be things like that, like in terms of how the conversation flows.
Well, you guys have a brighter picture than I do because I really didn't play through that much of Crisis Core. But like, the only thing that I can tell you concretely that Zach still being alive, the only thing I know for certain that does is it complicates Cloud and Aerith's relationship.
I was going to ask though, because like, sorry to cut you off there, mate, but like, I didn't think he was alive when I saw that. It's only now when I'm hearing you two talk that I was
he's alive. Yeah.
Oh, dude, he's definitely alive.
Because like that was the thing, because they essentially reused the cutscene from Crisis Core. I will say, as a little side note, this is just a personal thing, they should have rehired the voice actor for Zach. That breaks my heart. Like, not that the guy who plays him has a bad voice, but it's not Zach. # not my Zach.
Yeah.
But it's just,
I think everybody's new. I think the whole cast is new.
All new. But it's I was kind of like just more, especially that moment where you see him and Aerith overlap. Especially if you have played Crisis Core, there's a really heartbreaking moment in it where Zach goes on his last mission before he sees Aerith, and that's what is Nibelheim. What happens with Sephiroth?
Yeah.
And he's been captured for basically almost, 3 years or something?
Yeah.
And he doesn't realize it. And he gets like this final letter from Aerith saying, like, I've wrote you all these letters, but this is the last one because I just can't keep hurting myself anymore because I don't know if you're alive.
Yeah.
And it was just like, for me, it was just like I said, one of those heartbreaking moments where I was seeing them, and like that was the first game that ever made me cry as well. Like I was like, fuck, big boys don't cry. But like how, again, they said if he's alive or how they're going to show that. And Yeah, fuck, I have no idea. It's a weird, especially like I said, there's spirits, the fates, all
Yeah.
of that stuff. It's such a question.
The one thing I would say is I see it like same as Blake. He is alive in some alternate timeline. I don't know how they interact.
Yeah.
Like I don't know how they cross or how they come into each other's timeline. Obviously now we have fate and destiny and all these ghosts and stuff. There's multitudes of ways they can probably bring this as an event, but I will be interested to see how and inevitably they end up meeting.
Yeah. No. So I guess, guys, it's been an hour and 20 minutes and it's been a great chat. Should we talk about the overall ending as we're kind of touching on it now? How did you find the endings there? I'll let you go first, Blake.
Yeah, I feel like it's such a classic Tetsuya Nomura ending, isn't it? Like it's with like these ghostly apparitions, these like sort of pseudo heartless creatures that are having some kind of dramatic effect on the world and on the fate of the characters and stuff. I liked it for what it was. I'm totally down with what they delivered at the end of the game. Like I liked that it created this new future, this new possibility space for where the game can go, and how it set itself up now to defy our expectations in ways that are exciting. I think that stuff is great. I hope that it doesn't return and become even more layered and more complex, because I think that Kingdom Hearts is great in a way, but if you've ever watched any of these videos that try to explain the entire story of Kingdom Hearts to you, have you guys ever seen one of these videos that's like, let me try to explain Kingdom Hearts in an hour? It's completely crazy. Like, it's completely crazy because all these things get layered, like timelines and characters that are other characters and reincarnation. And like, I hope that they keep it simple. Like, if they keep the idea of like there are these spirits and they try to maintain the timeline and then maybe they come back and they still just try to do that and we understand what that is, and then maybe there's a new element but it doesn't add a whole nother layer to that. I hope that it's just kept simple. That's all I'm gonna say about that. I guess functionally, totally fine with what they did.
Yes, similar to Blake. Like respect what they did. Like obviously they've opened up like this world of possibility now for where the Final Fantasy VII story can kind of go. I didn't really have a problem with it, and one thing I really liked about it which caught me really off guard, is the fact we actually got to fight Sephiroth. I did not think in a million years that we'd necessarily fight Sephiroth in this game, but basically what they'd done is took Advent Children and let you play that. They just let you play that fight. Like that fight was the way it was set up, the way it was kind of choreographed, like with everything going on around you. If you remember the fight from the end of Advent Children, like when Cloud and Sephiroth are fighting each other, stuff falling down around you, and you're like fighting on these floating plates. I was like, yeah, you've basically just taken what you did as a movie like so many years ago and turned it into an interactive experience. So yeah, that was a really big highlight for the end of the game.
Yeah, I'll say that I enjoyed it. Seeing, like I said earlier, seeing Zack, whether that be the mystery of it or what was like a nice, fan service moment for me. But like the whole kind of boss battle, I thought was very interesting overall. Like I said, with the fight with Sephiroth and kind of elementals there, and just that stepping into the portal, that was such like a different feel to it as well. And that's where I was like, oh, okay. And it really did feel like it was the last time you knew you were going to be there. Like it really did feel that. So I think that was really well executed. All right, then, everyone. I think this is where we're going to wrap up. And this has been fantastic, boys. Absolute pleasure having you on. Do you guys want to say where people can reach out to you, where they can get in contact? Jonathan, do you want to go first, mate?
Yeah, sure. So as always, you can reach out to me, chat level design, nerd out about Final Fantasy, as we just had for the last hour, at omni/92 on Twitter. That's usually the best place to get me.
Yeah, and if you want to reach out to me, see what I'm up to, what I'm baking these days, or what I think about the games I'm playing, I'm at Big Rebo at Twitter.
Awesome. And if you want to reach out to me, you can do so on Twitter at MaxPairs. Or if you want to email onto the show, please do so at leveldesignlobby@gmail.com. And if you do want to support the show, please head over to patreon.com/leveldesignlobby. So thank you all very much, and we'll catch you all next time.